and that not every minor firefight should be seen as the death knell of peace. In other words, to try and look at sustainability and look at the bigger picture. Now, in my time as ambassador, we had over a dozen such ceasefire efforts, none lasting more than a week or two. This one comes with more rules and conditions, which are to bind not only Ukraine's armed forces, but also the 1st and 2nd Army Corps of the so-called republics, which we all know to be wholly commanded and operated by the Russian Federation's Southern Military District. Russia may say it's not involved, but we all know on the basis of both open and closed sources that it is very much in control. So lots to expand on and grapple with in the 15-minute keynote address. It will be in Ukrainian with simultaneous interpretation. You'll be getting, those of you on Zoom will be getting the interpretation directly in the interpretation tab at the bottom of your screens. Those on Facebook will have to practice their Ukrainian comprehension skills and get an English version spliced in later when the recording comes on. As Europe is an all-encompassing factor, both in security and humanitarian terms, Mr. Enrique Mora Benavente, Political Director of the European External Action Service, will be present throughout our presentations with both remarks following Deputy Prime Minister Reznikov and some closing summary comments. James Scher of the Estonian Foreign Policy Institute in Chatham House will draw on his most recent study of Russia-Ukraine relations over the past 4 centuries to set out some contextual both worries and hopes. Hanna Hopko, former chair of the Rada Foreign Relations Committee and now head of the ANTS think tank, will share some of her hard-earned experience in parliamentary engagement on peace, where you can both pay a political price for pragmatism. She was kicked out of the caucus that got her elected after agreeing to compromises on Donbass in 2015, but also be challenged by growing polarization. That is one of the phenomena we're seeing in Ukraine. Paul Grod, who heads our event's co-sponsor, the Ukrainian World Congress, will talk about the people aspects of reintegration and civil society approaches to winning hearts and minds on both sides of the front line, as well as internationally. Those of you from around the world who've registered will then get to have your questions answered. And in fact, because Deputy Prime Minister Reznikov has cabinet business to attend to, we will slot in an initial 10-minute Q&A session with him right after Mr. Scher's presentation. So be prepared. Think of your questions for Deputy Prime Minister Reznikov first, and then other panelists you can engage with in our wrap-up Q&A period. We'll be providing interpretation for the Deputy Prime Minister's speech, Ukrainian to English. If you look at the tab, you'll see there is a tab for English. There's, if you want that version, click there. There's also a tab for Portuguese. It is non-functional. Ukrainian has not yet been fully integrated. It's masquerading as Portuguese, but focus on the English tab. If you have any technical issues with interpretation, please write in the chat function to panelists and the support team can support them. Again, for Facebook viewers, you'll be getting the English in the post-production version, which will be going up shortly after this event. And so with all that said and done, I would like to invite Deputy Prime Minister Oleksiy Reznikov to launch our discussion with his keynote.
Good afternoon. I hope that you can hear me. I will keep my pace in moderation for the purposes of clear interpretation. I would like to thank you for the invitation to have a say on this important panel. At the same time, I would like to greet you.
Які кожного ранку отримує президент України, прем'єр-міністр України, міністри, в якому кожного разу ми маємо інформацію, як
available every morning. We have the reports on the front line in the east of Ukraine, 400 kilometers of the contact line that appeared after the aggression of the Russian Federation that started in 2014. with the first occupation of the Autonomous Republic of the Crimea and the city of Sevastopol, and partially also included Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast territories. And this morning we had 0 wounded, 0 killed in action, because unfortunately we had no casualties of any kind with the Ukrainian soldiers or civilians for that matter. The ceasefire was announced at 000 at the 27th of July because of the agreement with the two side or contact group, also online. We had video conference for the group, and we reached the agreement for additional arrangements for sustainable ceasefire regime, and this is ceasefire plus the silence regime. We have registered some violations at 20 minutes, 45 minutes, 0045, and the third one closer to the morning. Is it a ceasefire breach? I think it is not. This is just the violation of silence regime, because with the auxiliary activities, we have checks and inspections on the violators, and we inform the monitoring mission of OSCE that will form subsequently the trilateral contact group to investigate such violations. Today we are having an extraordinary meeting of the security subgroup of the trilateral security group to discuss the 3 cases of violations reported by the by Mr. Kravchenko, the commander of the Joint Operations Force. Now we have put the Minsk process right, because in the course of recent years, according to my observations, the dominant issue was political aspects, and we tended to forget about security. Now, if we look closer at the documents, so the founding documents of Minsk Accords, item number 1 is ceasefire and the silence regime. Established no political settlements or legal arrangements cannot be discussed unless we regulate the security issues. Even if we imagine that the Ukrainian parliament should discuss the item 11, discussing the necessity to have devolution, decentralization in Ukraine, or adoption of some statutory acts on special regime for self-governance in certain districts of rayons of the Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast. So the parliament is the mirror reflection, mirror image of the society. With the lack of ceasefire, we cannot discuss anything of the kind, neither in the society nor in the parliament. Now we can be hopeful and hope for de-escalation in the conditions. Many critics would argue that we've had several attempts of ceasefire, never observed by the opposing side, and this is true, and we are watching very carefully, trying the oversight, and we understand that this is another attempt, another chance for the Minsk Accords to become operational. I would like to say that on the 31st of 2015, the Minsk Accords expired. It was all about 2014, 2015, I would like to remind you. But presently, Minsk is the Normandy format function, and leaders of Germany and France are helping Ukraine as advocates with this military conflict that was launched by the Russian Federation. And we created the logistics center in Minsk, and the idea was to work on technicalities in our respective groups under the Normandy format. I would like to remind you that this year we had the Paris summit under the Normandy format. We reached certain agreements which we can regard as a roadmap for the Minsk process, the ceasefire, armistice, and humanitarian issues, new areas for withdrawal of the forces, mining, and mutual exchange of hostages, all for all. And also that includes the legal aspects of Minsk agreements. In my view, we have come back to the dominating narrative when the securities issues right supreme. And presently, I would like to reassure the critics of the ceasefire that the armed forces of Ukraine cannot respond with fire. I would like to remind you of the international law norms, and that includes the UN Charter, Article 51. Any country can defend itself and protect itself, and that's what we are using, have been since the onslaught of this aggression. There's also Article 40 of the Hague Convention adopted in 1907, and it regulates the laws and the customs of law. Article 40 of the convention stipulates that if the ceasefire is violated by one of the parties, the other party can also leave the regime and reinstitute war activities. But of course, the Minsk agreement expired in the end of 2015. We have no other issue or other venue to regulate some kind of peace in the occupied part of Ukraine, the Ukrainian Donbass, Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast, for the political also resolution and political arrangement, meaning the elections. We are doing everything possible, but we understand that secure reintegration of the territories is the principal issue here. I would like to re-emphasize that it should be secure, this reintegration. All the things that will be unfolding should not be in conflict with the territorial integrity and statehood and unity of Ukraine as a state. So we can see that Minsk agreements are still in effect. Canada, UK, US, in addition to Germany and France, under the Normandy format, are helping Ukraine with the sanctions against the aggressor, the Russian Federation, with the several waves of these sanctions. That's also decision-making on continuation or renewal of the sanctions to oppose the Russian attempts, and the civilized countries, our partners, are because the Russian Federation is a party to the trilateral contact group and is obligated under such conditions. They argue that they are intermediaries in this process. They are a party to the process. Germany and France are intermediaries and OSCE as far as the Normandy format is concerned, but we are the two parties to the contact group, the Russian Federation and Ukraine. We would like to reassure everyone we are committed to the process. We increase the representation. As you know, we have myself from the government, two deputy ministers, the defense minister deputy for the security group, and the economic group, and three MPs, head of committee of legal policy for the political group, humanitarian group, head of the committee, and one of the deputy heads of delegation is the head of committee of the parliament for the international affairs. So both governmental officials and the parliamentarians are represented. I would like to remind you that for 6 years we had that monopoly of representation. The invited representatives from certain rayons of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts from the side of the Russian Federation people, invited by OSCE, were citizens of the Russian Federation, and we announced that for the world and presented this to the world. We demonopolized this representation. From our side, we have IDPs represented the interests of the occupied part of the Ukrainian Donbas, 2 people from Donetsk and 2 people from Luhansk Oblast, and they are negotiators and they are participating in the political group proceedings. The 11th item and the 12th and the 9th, if I'm not the 9th, if I'm not mistaken, and they stipulate that all the reconciliation, all the consultations should be done with participation of representatives of the occupied part of the Ukrainian Donbas, and that was agreed upon in 2014. So we have the IDPs in accordance to that. And there are many issues in hand, using the opportunity and the pandemic situation, the COVID-19 threat. Representatives of the occupation regime use quarantine restrictions and prevent access for now OSCE representatives and the Red Cross representatives to the territories in question. Last December in Paris, though, leaders of the Normandy format with the president of the Russian Federation participating on the control and monitoring of OSCE monitoring mission 24/7, and for the Red Cross, any access without restrictions to the people who are held prisoners or hostages. Ukraine compliant with that, and after the Paris summit, we amended the legislation. Now representatives from the Red Cross have access to all the people held by the Ukrainian penitentiary system. I'd like to conclude saying that in any case, if we discuss secure integration, regardless of the length of the negotiation process, the time taken up by the settlement, we can see already that one of the prerequisites of secure integration is economic revival of the Ukrainian part of Donbas, Luhansk, and Donetsk Oblast, starting with the territories under control of the Ukrainian government. Currently, we are creating the funds. We are drafting the economic strategy program for development of Donbas. So we will present it very soon as possible. And all the things in favor of reintegration of Donbass are starting here, and we would like to win the hearts and the minds of the people who are currently hostages of the occupation regimes, and we should not forget about the temporarily occupied Crimea and the city of Sevastopol. At the end of our meeting, I'll be available for the questions if there are any from the audience and from the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Deputy Prime Minister. We will now proceed to the presentation by Mr. James Scher, and then that will allow us to collect even more questions. We already have about 7 or 8 questions for Mr. Reznikov, package them, and then have an opportunity for Q&A immediately following the next presentation. So now over to Tallinn, Estonia, to Mr. James Scher.
Thank you, Ambassador Wastruk. Thank you all. This is a very important occasion, and I am most definitely delighted and honored to be here. The Minsk Accords were largely the product of force, and its provisions might ultimately be imposed by force. But the accords themselves were also the product of tough and skillful negotiation by Ukraine and its partners. Russia has exploited the ambiguities and contradictions in the accords to its own interests and to the utmost. There is no reason why Ukraine should not do the same. Nevertheless, over the past year, the premise underpinning Ukraine's overall approach is a premise that one can question. The premise appears to be that Russia wishes to end the war on terms that Ukraine can accept, and that a sequence of conciliatory, confidence-building steps, disengagement zones, prisoner exchanges, and so on, will make it easier for Russia to end it. This is not only the premise in Kiev, it is also shared in several European capitals. Unfortunately, this is a proposition entirely unsupported by evidence. Moscow has different premises. That President Zelensky is inexperienced, that his administration is conflicted, that Ukraine's most capable and committed ally, the United States, is in disarray, that transatlantic relations are profoundly damaged, and that at least one of Ukraine's two principal European partners is seeking to resolve the Ukraine issue through a form of soft euthanasia. These premises explain why Vladislav Surkov was replaced as Russia's plenipotentiary resolving the conflict by Dmitry Kozak early this year. Nevertheless, beginning at the Paris Normandy summit of December 2019, President Zelensky responded by introducing several new positive elements regarding the border, regarding the participation of IDPs in elections, and as the Deputy Prime Minister knows well, and he is largely responsible for it, including representatives of internally displaced Ukrainians into Ukraine's delegation to the Trilateral Contact Group. Needless to say, this toughening of Ukraine's position has caught Russia off balance. However, to suppose that Moscow will just gently sit back and acquiesce is not only optimistic, it might be dangerously optimistic, and therefore I think we need to think also about some starker and darker set of alternatives. One thing we definitely need to consider is whether the latest ceasefire is not a path to conflict settlement in a way congenial to all of us, but instead a maneuver to provide further pretexts that Russia has already articulated for an escalation, a military escalation to the conflict. Let me mention three of the political pretexts that Russia has already articulated. First, as Moscow puts it, Ukraine's refusal to respect the Minsk Accords as written, как там написано. And there have been several ultimata put in the form of questions by Foreign Minister Lavrov, by Dmitry Peskov, and so on. Do you recognize, do you still abide by the Minsk Accords as written, meaning as we in Moscow interpret them? Number two, the potential for a monumental humanitarian catastrophe in Crimea, caused by the water shortage and the blockade, entirely laid at the doorstep of Ukraine. And number three, most of all, articulated in several interviews by one article and one interview by President Putin, that Ukraine is one of the states that includes territories that are historically Russian and that have been taken from Russia, and that the basis on which Russia has always acquiesced in this, going back even before Putin became president, was that the state would be formed and constitutionally run on a basis that would respect the legitimate interests of Russia's compatriots, which, as Russia emphasized in 2014, are not being respected. To this set of political pretexts, now the ceasefire possibly adds some new ones. First, as we have said already, the Russian Federation, its armed forces, its command structures are not subjects of these ceasefire accords. The only entities subject to these ceasefire accords are the official command structures of the ordered law. And therefore, it should surprise nobody that after these first ceasefire violations, Dmitry Peskov said it has nothing to do with us. You must address the parties concerned. Secondly, if I may differ slightly from what we have heard, if you look at the specifics and the detail, Ukraine's armed forces, if attacked, may not simply retaliate. They must go through a procedure of registering and documenting this and seeking authorization through the mechanisms established by the contact group, and then in the end through their own higher command authority. And one therefore has to ask, and military people already are asking, how many minutes, how many hours will lapse under fire, under bombardment, before Ukrainian forces are authorized to return fire and do so effectively. The devil is in the details, and the details here command attention, and I would suggest that these details provide highly advantageous conditions for those who want to divide Ukraine from its partners and divide the president from the army and undermine confidence in the president and in the command structures of the armed forces, and moreover persuade Europe that Ukraine's armed forces are out of control. The issue is not simply that the ceasefire might be unworkable. We have to entertain the possibility that it has been designed to break down. Finally, there are very strong factors that must discourage Moscow from escalation. Russia does not feel as strong as it did in 2014, not even as strong as it did several months ago. It faces a combination of expected and unexpected internal problems, if not crises, which are very severe. The public appetite for further military adventures that existed clearly in 2014 over Crimea is not present now. But then there is another worrying factor, the biggest one perhaps. Should Joe Biden become president of the United States next year, then the advantageous moment and conditions that I described are likely rapidly to disappear, and Russia will be dealing with a much stronger administration with a much stronger policy towards Russia. in these conditions, I think it would be surprising if people at the highest levels were not asking whether the moment of decision regarding Ukraine for Russia is now, and whether Russia is obliged to take advantage of the limited time, the limited period of advantage still open to it. I have no instinct, or let alone prediction, about what the result of such a discussion would be. We do not sit in the Kremlin, but it would be too naive by far to suppose that such a discussion is not taking place. And on that cheerful note, I will end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. A lot to chew over there. I had mentioned at the outset that the European Union is all-encompassing. Its political director of the European External Action Service, Enrique Mora, is with us now. And would you care to share with us a few opening thoughts? And we'll come back to you later, Mr. Mora, because Deputy Prime Minister Reznikov needs to also get his questions answered, or answer questions that people have been submitted, and then move on to his next cabinet meeting.
Thank you, Ambassador. Yes, I will be short, because I'm aware of the commitment of the Deputy Prime Minister, which I'm very grateful for his words and his presentation. You know, there is a new team in Brussels since the 1st of December last year, and if there is a constant in the EU foreign policy, is our full support to Ukraine, to the territorial integrity and to the sovereignty of the country. We have had high-level contacts with Ukraine over these months, even with the pandemic. The Prime Minister was here last week. He signed an agreement for macroeconomic assistance up to 1.2 billion euros. He saw the High Representative Borrell. So all in all, we continue, as I said before, our support for the full implementation of the Minsk agreements. I heard the previous speaker and the intervention of the Deputy Prime Ministers, and I have to say that for us the role of Russia is very clear. It's not a mediator, it's part of the conflict. It has to be part of the solution. If Russia wants that the European Union stops the sanctions that were put on Russia before of the illegal and unilateral annexation of Crimea and before the actions in the Donbass. So this is still our position. It will be our position until we see clear progress. And I will stop here because time is pressing. I will come back at the end if you wish, Ambassador, and it will be a pleasure to hear the debate. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Political Director Mora. And I think your final point about Russia's role is key to the discussion, and especially given the fact that in both political and security terms, the EU is such a significant player. Now, for Deputy Prime Minister Reznikov, we have here several questions from people such as Dmitro Shkurko of the National News Agency, Tetiana and Mr. Arne Dalhaug, who are all asking a similar question, which is, and Stefan Romaniu from Australia, centering on the Peskov statement that Russia has nothing to do with shooting or not shooting, talk to the hand, don't talk to us. How are you going to be handling this cognitive dissonance that is being sown from the Kremlin?
The mic is off, unfortunately. Yes, all right. So the issue...
Українських засобів масової інформації прокоментувати висловили прес-секретаря президента Росії. Справа в тому, що люди, які ведуть перемовини в трьохсторонній контактній групі, це одні люди, а люди, які пишуть офіційні стейтменти або їх коментують, це інші люди. І навіть якщо це виходить за підписом однієї і тієї ж самої людини, це точно все одно автори різні. І я би хотів звернути увагу шановної аудиторії, що вислови пана, на якого ви посилаєтесь, вони адресовані в першу чергу не Україні. Вони в першу чергу адресовані суспільству в Російській Федерації безпосередньо всередині. А в другу чергу вони
And secondly, it is offered to the European nations and other nations because the Russian side are trying to convince the sanction imposing parties that they should not be sanctioned because they are not a party to this conflict. So Mr. Peskov states that they are not responsible, cannot be held responsible for this armistice or ceasefire. It is not that the case when they cannot, but they do not want to do that. They do not want to demonstrate that they're directly involved in this hybrid war, this proxy war. It's not a secret to anyone that all the armed forces of several rayons of Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast, I'm using the vocabulary of the Minsk agreement, some rayons on Luhansk and Donetsk paramilitary, oblast paramilitary or military groups, which are part and parcel of the 1st and 2nd Army Corps of the Russian Federation. And the command is Russian, the commanding officers are Russian, and they give orders which are executed by some mercenaries and other proxy militants. It's not a secret to anyone, to you, or leaders of the Normandy format for that matter. This is a game which is played by them. They are arguing that they cannot be held responsible, but we know who instructs who. They can play this game, but the most important thing is for them to comply with their obligations. They committed, their representative plenipotentiary committed the Russian side with his signature to that. At our last meeting in Berlin, when we had the political Normandy 4 advisors for 8 or 9 hours, we had this discussion of security and some additional measures for the sustainable armistice. And that's my comment as far as the impressions are voiced.
Thank you very much. There's a question that's coming from Unian, and that is that there are reports that former President Kuchma will be leaving his position at the Trilateral Contact Group. And so are you then, Mr. Reznikov, now the main man and the main representative from Ukraine at the Minsk talks?
The point is that the second president of Ukraine, Leonid Kuchma, for 6 years was involved, was committing himself, his soul, his heart, his health, and his power. And Leonid Kuchma started arguing that he was ready for the rotation. He approached President Zelensky. President Zelensky announced that in May, if I'm not mistaken, that was the open air press briefing. And he mentioned there that Leonid Kuchma was asking President to be excused from this process because he is a retiree and he wanted to retire. I'm first deputy of head of the delegation and can be regarded as an acting head for the time being, but I would like to draw attention to the presidential decree which is pending It's up to president and his presidential decree. Unless announced otherwise by such a decree, Leonid Kuchma remains the head of our delegation officially, and a new one will be appointed by the decree in question. This should be some highly prominent Ukrainian patriarch, some prominent figure with considerable experience to be viewed as a patriarch of some kind. And Minsk process should be given proper attention and proper weight by the appointment. Who is this appointee is to be? It's up to President Zelensky, but we will soon discover. And of course, I will cooperate with this person for the benefit of Ukraine.
A question from Kate. Is the government dedicated to providing medical aid to Ukrainian citizens on both sides of the conflict? And I think you've already addressed the question of the Red Cross, but the question of access for international organizations. And then also a question from Tatiana Tarasenko of the Ukrainian organizations in Italy. How best can organized Ukrainians abroad support you in the work that you are doing?
Ну, напевно, по першому питанню, може, ти додаш?
Well, maybe you can add something about the humanitarian aid. With your permission, we have Deputy Minister Igor Yeremenko, who is directly responsible for the international cooperation, European integration, and humanitarian missions. He is well versed in this, and so he will try to answer, and then I will take my turn. Igor, in fact, at the ministry, we are trying to arrange the crossing of the contact line for all the humanitarian organizations. We're trying to accommodate that and facilitate. We are grateful to the UN, to the International Committee of Red Cross, and they are concentrating their operations on the medical aid to the people on both sides of the contact line. Such cargoes cross the contact line every week, practically. So on our part, we are trying to provide for the best facilitation to solve all the pressing issues related to the crossing of the line, because we understand that it should be expedient and medical aid should be timely and quick. Recently, we were approached by one international organization with the request to deliver a very specific cargo to the part of the Ukrainian Donbass not under the governmental control, and that cargo is needed to fight COVID-19 pandemic, and we arranged that shipment, and it is underway. Yesterday, the delivery was made actually to the territory not under the Ukrainian governmental control. And the other question, what kind of assistance we can accommodate coming from the Ukrainians abroad? I'm convinced that those are our main lobbyists, the champions of our cause, and they can raise their voice and make our interests visible in their respective countries and their communities to support Ukraine, to sustain the sanction regime, because I was really surprised to discover that in the UK, people who are not really political, they think that the war stopped in Ukraine. There's no war anymore. They believe that. And that means that we are talking right now, we are trying to arrange very important matters, but we are trying to inform people and we are trying to let people know about the actual state of affairs, the state of play, and we would like to thank the Ukrainian World Congress. We are having a big meeting with the representatives of this Congress, and we will have the opportunity to discuss in more detail the specificity, specific assistance. But thank you very much for being concerned with this matter.
Final question before we allow the Deputy Prime Minister to move on to his next event. How, asks Ukrinform, can the OSCE and the international community actually operate on the occupied territories in Donbass? And isn't there a risk that there will be a sort of unbalanced pressure on the Ukrainian side, which is more open and accessible to internationals?
Станом на сьогоднішній день я можу прокоментувати.
As of today, I can comment referring to the information that we keep receiving. Well, the reports, Ambassador Chevik, who is wearing the head of the monitoring mission of OSCE in Ukraine, and also the coordinator of the security group. Ambassador Chevik, chairing the security group at the trilateral group, there's no access for the patrols of sea to the territory not under the control, but there's some kind of contingent or personnel, I think is a better word. In English, it's staff, should be staff, so they're staffers. But the number of staffers is downsized because of the restrictions related to the pandemic and the necessity of rotation, and the number of people from SMM OSCE conducting audit monitoring is less than the operational status requires. Now, they cannot physically move in an expedient way in the temporarily occupied territories to do the 100% coverage and monitoring. So the issue in hand is making reliable checkpoints. The Ukrainian checkpoints are all open and accessible every morning. The patrols of OSCE, SMM come, and we are prepared to let them through. But the other side prevents them from doing so. At every meeting of the trilateral group, we raise this issue, but there is no positive development yet.
Thank you very much, Deputy Prime Minister. And now we've all been quite disciplined, including our next panelist, Hanna Hopko, who's been waiting patiently to share her thoughts from a former parliamentary and current think tank perspective.
Thank you, Ambassador. It's a privilege for me to join today's discussion and to share my experience. So, of course, I'm probably less optimistic or not that optimistic regarding the recent attempts on the ceasefire, because I've seen many efforts from international community and from previous administration actually to see the ceasefire. But it seems like Russia remains reluctant to leave Ukraine in peace in the near future. And the Caucus 2020 military trainings is another evidences, the same like militarization of Crimea and different hybrid warfare elements that Russia is using against Ukraine inside Ukraine. So, but still, coming back to 2015, I remember the situation when Ukraine was suffering from macroeconomic situation, and the key for us was to restore macroeconomic stability, to build Ukrainian armed forces from scratch with volunteer support. And of course, it was important to generate transatlantic unity and consolidated positions in the issue of countering Russian hybrid warfare in Ukraine. It was really very hard for us to convince our Western alliance that this is not internal conflict, and only after MH17, this strategy helped the world to realize that we are dealing with actually we are dealing with interstate war, and of course the truth matters in this case, and it's really important that our EU and NATO partners, they should consider Russian unlawful invasion of Ukraine as interstate war. But why? I remember when Ukraine was pushed to amend constitution, and at that time in 2015, we truly believed that this will open a way to guarantee the ceasefire. But unfortunately, from 2015 to 2020, we are now still discussing, and I'm really very happy that now our government reintroduced the security first principle with the key fields like actually including comprehensive ceasefire, withdrawal of Russian forces and armament from the territory of Ukraine. But it seems still not enough, because I think that OSCE monitoring mission, and I hope that next our discussion we will see among speakers also the representatives of OSCE knowing their role at the battlefield and in this situation. So also I think that it's really important to talk about the strategies, both Ukrainian strategies, how to restore territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine, and the Western strategy. Because it seems like from President Poroshenko to President Zelensky, and probably to the next president of Ukraine, I will not, of course, we would like to see the victory of Ukraine, but it seems like it's not in the interest of Putin, especially after the changes of Russian constitution. So I think it's really important for our Western partners to keep supporting Ukrainian army. And NATO recently recognized Ukraine as an enhanced opportunities partner. This status is a big step on Ukraine's path towards Euro-Atlantic integration, but it's not enough. And I think after North Macedonia, the 30th member of NATO alliance, Ukraine or Georgia, or Ukraine and Georgia should be considered as the next members through receiving membership action plan. And because Ukraine needs NATO no less than NATO needs Ukraine. Why I'm mentioning this geopolitical perspective? Because I think that for Mr. Putin, who understands only the strength of power, besides sanctions, which is really good, but I still think that, and I'm asking, having today Enrique Mora and lots of viewers, that it's really important, and please keep assisting and in strengthening the new strengthening sanctions, and especially sanctions after building Kerch bridge. Also, we would be happy to see sanctions for passportization, which is ongoing, and we understand why Putin and Russia is conducting passportization, which is really very dangerous and could create a lot of risk in the future. So I think it's really important from NATO perspective, and I hope Ukrainian side will propose a plan how to use this EOP, and also to conduct a next step towards receiving membership action plan. And since we are preparing for October Ukraine-EU summit, which is really very important, and especially after the EU-Western Balkans approach and Euro integration for Albania and North Macedonia, I think it's really important, besides talking about upgrading of the association agreement between Ukraine and the EU, also to be more ambitious towards Ukraine. This is what Putin is afraid of, and I hope that the presidency of Germany at the EU will propose Ukraine more ambitious agenda in our relations. And of course, observing the situation from the dignity revolution. At that time, I used to be one of the co-founder of the reanimation package of reforms. And then when Russia started its military invasion through attempted annexation of Crimea and then Russian hybrid warfare in Donbass, so I could say that Ukraine truly become one of the resilient nations of European continent countering Russian hybrid warfare. But still, it's really important in the future to see more support from the EU, and when EU shouldn't be so naive, because I don't think that this ceasefire negotiations will be implemented from Putin's side, because it's not in his interest. And also, I think that it's important to invest in making Ukraine institutionally strong, keep focusing, demanding reforms, especially state security service reform, judiciary reform, police reform, which will make Ukraine much stronger and also help us to be more resistant. And I have to mention Nord Stream 2. And I truly believe that Nord Stream 2 as an existential threat for Ukraine and European energy, and not energy, but in general, European security is a true threat. So I think, and I hope that some of our European partners like Germany will finally understand that Putin's hybridization to use energy as a weaponizing energy is really very dangerous for the European unity. So Nord Stream 2 should be stopped. And also Ukraine is suing Russia at different international courts. And I hope that one day we will see the final decision of international court on MH17, because all these cases, like Skripal case, then Khantoshvili case and others, so it's Russia, Putin's Russia should be considered one day as a sponsor of terrorism, and another strong sanctions should be imposed. And to conclude, I think it's really important for Ukrainian government and Ukrainian president to improve their communications and to bring to the table, instead of Mr. Kuchma, with all his connections with his Mr. Pinchuk as an oligarch and others, truly professionals. And I hope that Zelensky, after more than 1 year of his presidency, will realize that if he wants to defend national interest of Ukraine, he has to count on or rely on true professionals in diplomacy, in foreign affairs, and also in people in different reforms, because without success in reforms for Ukraine, it will be harder and harder to generate international support. And usually our foreign partners, they're using excuses saying, okay, you are not doing well with reforms, why should we support Ukraine? Or trying to blame Ukraine instead of increasing pressure on Russia Federation, because Russia is an aggressor state. And please do not press Ukraine to make painful compromises or try to solve the conflict at the expense of Ukrainian national interest, because successful Ukraine is a nightmare for Mr. Putin, but it's a crucially important model for the whole post-Soviet space. And observing what's going on in inside Russian Federation and what Putin is afraid of, besides declining oil prices, pandemic, demographical situation in Russian Federation, I think a strong Ukraine with rule of law will be a trigger for transformation within Russian society, because we in Ukraine, we are optimistic regarding our future, even if we are paying a huge price. And this centuries fight between Moscow Empire, then Soviet Union, and now Russian Federation, still Ukraine will be among the winners. And without strong support and deep understanding of Western civilization, it will be hard to achieve this. So I hope that Ukrainian officials will also communicate with Ukrainian veterans community, with representatives of different protest organizations like the Movement of Capitulation, to avoid potential tensions which might be used in the interest of Russian Federation. So if you don't have nothing to hidden, so please improve your communications within the Ukrainian society. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Hanna and Paul Grod from the World Congress on the people side of things.
Thank you, Ambassador Verstruk, dear colleagues, dear participants. I'd like to talk briefly and try not to repeat what my colleagues have spoke about, and I'll try to summarize it briefly because time is not on our side, is talking about a roadmap to peace and how to best engage civil society. First off, I'd like to thank the Vice Prime Minister for his words earlier about his willingness to cooperate with the Ukrainian World Congress on bringing peace to Ukraine. We look forward to engaging in that discussion very soon. My introductory comment is, number one, is that peace requires willing parties. And what's most concerning is that there is nothing today that is really compelling Russia, other than significant compromises by Ukraine, which will unfortunately weaken its sovereignty. Things like elections in the occupied territories. And these are things that we should be very, very careful and very mindful of. We must also encourage Ukraine not to bargain against themselves. We must encourage Ukraine to continually use clear and unequivocal language. And the world must use that as well. I have to share with you, I was in Paris during the last Normandy discussions, and listening to the French media, it was unbelievable the interpretation they had about the Normandy format peace discussions, in that they painted Russia as the party that was trying to help solve Ukraine's civil conflict. And that's the kind of language that is very problematic, and that really falls into Russia's disinformation campaign. It's incredibly important that we use clear, unequivocal language. This is Russia's war against Ukraine. This is not a civil war. The DNR and LNR are not separatists. They are political and military units organized and controlled by Russia. And this daily shelling is initiated by Russia to destabilize Ukraine. So those are some key points that we need to continue to remind ourselves and the current leadership of Ukraine. There are also the red lines. We've heard this many times. The Ukrainian World Congress has been very clear and unequivocal about the various red lines that we believe would significantly harm Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, such things as no elections in Ukraine without Ukraine's control and removal of Russia's military occupation. We also talk about green lines, and these are things that we want to continue to encourage Ukraine to move in the direction. We need to continue Ukraine to engage with NATO, and want to congratulate Ukraine for its recent achievement of enhanced opportunity partnership with NATO. We're also calling on Ukraine to call for the international community to step in with bold initiatives such as a UN peacekeeping force. It's also important to emphasize that Ukraine will not solve this by themselves. It's incredibly important that allies not be kept in the dark as to Ukraine's plan. And that's often what we are hearing around the world from the governments that we continuously interact with is, what is Ukraine's plan? And so what's key is that Ukraine engage and develop its plan for peace together with the allies, not just France and Germany, but also including key allies like the United States, Canada, and Great Britain, among others. And it's important for these allies to be engaged so that they are focused on what kind of consequences should they be imposing on Russia for breaking promises and for their continuing escalation. The other point is that it's key for Ukraine to engage its civil society at home in Ukraine, especially in the eastern borders with Russia and in the occupied territories. Even though there's not really organized civil society in the occupied territories, there are certainly strong civil society groups in eastern Ukraine which often do engage with the people in the occupied territories. And it's also incredibly important to engage with civil society abroad. in order to ensure that we are there supporting the advocacy, supporting the information campaign and the soft powers, and the soft power approach. Next point is one of the significant weak spots for Ukraine is the hearts and minds of its citizens. Russia is focused on returning the Ukrainian mindset into Russia's sphere of influence. We see that there is a continuous blast, and we hear this from our partners in eastern Ukraine, by Russia media bombarding south and eastern Ukraine, the occupied territories, with this constant propaganda and trying to dissuade Ukrainians from supporting their own government and their own efforts. So this international war, this information warfare is very, very critical to Ukraine. And this is where people-to-people engagement, Ukrainian NGOs in a meaningful way, can really go a long way in terms of building that hearts and minds support. It's also important to engage the Ukrainians in the occupied territories, and I was hoping to hear from Vice Prime Minister about any efforts that are being made there. What is, in our opinion, very important is it's very clear to make it clear to the people in the occupied territories that they are citizens of Ukraine, that they have not been abandoned, and they will get our support. And that it's also important to deliver the message to them that life in the occupied territories, they are suffering because of Russia's occupation. Otherwise, if they were part of Ukraine, they'd be part of a dynamic, free, and successful Ukrainian society. Finally, I also want to emphasize that we as civil society, as the organized Ukrainian diaspora around the world, believe that Ukraine's economic success is critical to its sovereignty. And I believe that President Zelensky has made that as one of his key priorities. But the economic success is predicated upon enshrining the rule of law and the development of democratic institutions. It's not going to happen based on some sort of economic nyanya or some sort of other personal guarantees. Things such as politically targeted prosecutions undermine the rule of law and the economy of Ukraine, and by extension, sovereignty. Finally, my last remark is that I really would like to congratulate President Zelensky and Vice Prime Minister Reznikov for their continued efforts to find peace. And it's not easy, it's very difficult, and we are there to help support them. We welcome things such as efforts to disengage forces, to try to seek peace and ceasefires, and efforts around prisoner exchanges. These are all steps in the right directions. We just need to make sure that they're the right situation for Ukraine, and that Ukraine is not making unnecessary and very dangerous compromises. Thank you very much. I look forward to the questions.
Thank you, Pavlo. Just for the record, in terms of participation, the OSCE was invited. Their representative, unfortunately, could not make it. They're probably for logistical reasons, plus there's some organizational issues happening in Vienna at OSCE headquarters. So that is certainly next time that any such discussion will happen. I think that invitation will be even more eagerly sent out to them. I understand as well that there is now a group of ambassadors of countries that are not in the Normandy format, but which are in touch with Deputy Prime Minister Reznikov to both hear from him what Ukraine's plans are and to provide constructive feedback. So part of what we're looking for is, I think, quietly beginning to happen in Kyiv. I would now go back to Political Director Mora to maybe add some more sort of flesh on the bones there of how the very broad-ranging association that Ukraine has with the EU can be harnessed for the purposes of peace building, peace processes in conflict resolution in Ukraine.
Thank you, Ambassador. It has been a very interesting debate and some interventions. I want to make 3 points. The first is we have to recognize that President Zelensky has shown political courage when dealing with the conflict. It is clear that he took an inclusive approach to the Ukrainians on both sides of the line of contact. Again, it is not without taking some risk at home that President Zelensky has done that. The result has been some measures agreed in the Paris summit in December. Before that, the Deputy Prime Minister was talking about the fact that there were 3 violations to the ceasefire, but he said that 0 casualties for the first time in quite some time. So more or less it is working. I remember you, Ambassador, saying that at your time in Ukraine, ceasefire was a sort of weekend habit that were quickly broken on Monday, but let's see whether this time things are different. But the important thing is that we have now this first endorsement of one of the measures taken at the Paris summit. So the title of the conference was either gradual political deadlock or gradual success. Well, could be. I mean, we still think that it could be gradual success in that sense, in the sense that President Zelensky has put a lot of political courage on the belt. The problem is that the Russian Federation is not reciprocating, and so we have the measures agreed in Paris, but it has taken 7 months to agree on only on one of them. Mrs. Hanna Hopko says she has requested the European Union not to be naive, and I'm sure she is expressing the minds of many. But I think that the European Union would be definitely naive if we thought about the conflict as isolated, as encapsulated from the bigger picture, both in Ukraine, the situation in Ukraine, and the strategic intentions of Russia. With that in mind, political courage shown by President Zelensky in the conflict should be accompanied by the same resolve in reforms in the country. Mr. Groth put it brilliantly. I mean, a functioning market economy, a vibrant economy is probably one of the best answers to recover Ukrainian sovereignty. But for that, you need reforms in different areas, guarantee rule of law. So for us from here, from Brussels' view, going ahead with the reforms, modernizing Ukraine, making it a functioning market economy is one of the most important subjects President Zelensky has to address in his mandate to deal with the conflict. And then we will see. Then we will see what happens with the conflict itself. But I think a priority is that one, and we are supporting Ukraine in that path. And I have to say that sometimes we have to apply some conditionality if we see that those reforms don't go ahead. And I will stop here because I think that the message of the debate is clearly given. We are very far away from peace and from recovering sovereignty for Ukraine in the Donbass. We are very far away from that. I think most of the intervenants have identified clearly the problems for achieving there. But again, I think that we have to look at the bigger picture, the situation in Ukraine, the geostrategic intentions of Russia over the country, and with all that in mind, maybe we could have a better approach to solving or trying to solve this gradual approach to the conflict. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mora. So we now go to the general Q&A, so you can still throw in a few more questions, either on the Q&A or on the chat. There is a question from Yars Balan in beautiful Edmonton about Western corporations skirting sanctions doing business with Russia. What is being done to ensure they're being respected in letter and spirit as opposed to pressure for normalization? That I think might be actually a question that goes to any of the panelists, but perhaps actually the EU in terms of the sanctions regime and business relationships.
Yes, two points. First, sanctions are decided at EU level. the implementation of sanctions is a national responsibility. So if one member state of the European Union is aware of one company has violated the sanctions in one way or another, it has to go, the national government will inform us, but at the same time, it has to go against that particular person or company who has violated the sanction regime. This part of the question of the business community and pressure for normalization, I think it was more evident, I had to say, 3-4 years ago. Now there is a sort of status quo. I'm not saying that they are starting to live with the sanctions company. Well, companies in market economy, they are able and they manage to learn to live with anything, with any kind of framework. But it is true that this pressure has diminished. At the same time, look at the figures of the external trade of Ukraine 5 years ago and now, or 6 years ago and now, and the change is really impressive towards the Western-oriented approach of Ukraine. Thank
you. Thank you. Something that was mentioned in several of the presentations, the question of what might Russian motivations be to make peace. I think Hanna Hopko mentioned about internal pressures, so did James Scher. How would any of you see, but especially James and Hanna, the evolving situation in Belarus and how that might impact on Russia's approach to its negotiations with Ukraine?
Do you want to hear from me? Hello, Roman? Yes. Look, the basic point is that the only sure way of persuading Russia to agree a peace that Ukraine can accept and that Europe can accept is to demonstrate to the people who matter in Russia that its objectives are simply unachievable. And that, to reiterate Paul's earlier point, I think requires a greater degree of clarity than we have demonstrated and far more tenacity and some willingness to take risk and accept sacrifice. For Russia, the willingness of a party involved in a conflict like this to accept inconvenience and sacrifice is a form of strength. And this is where Russia thinks they are stronger than we are. I think we have to change that perception. Now, the Belarus issue is as dramatic for Russia as it is for Ukraine, because you will not find anyone making decisions today in Russia who believes that it can remain a great power if it loses ultimate control, ultimate ability to manage the situation in Belarus, if Belarus is not integrated effectively into their system. With all the ugly family type discord between their elites and Lukashenko and its elites. So yes, what is going on there is very important. And let us hope that the various forms of soft landing are possible. Let us hope that there are people who matter in Belarus who are able to provide an evolutionary path out of the present situation. But these are hopes. And I'm not prepared to make any predictions at this point. I don't know if anyone else is.
Thank you. Either Hanna or Mr. Mora, Belarus.
For Ukraine, of course, the stability, predictability in Belarus as our neighbor and also neighbor of NATO and the EU countries like Poland, Lithuania is really very important. And for many years, we are trying to discuss with and to build different, different ways how to work with Belarus and how not to allow Mr. Putin to keep Belarus in the sphere of influence of Russian Federation. Because after Soviet Union collapsed, Russian doctrine of still keeping the former Soviet republics in their zone or sphere of interest, this doctrine should be changed. However, in the article written by Mr. Putin, dedicated to the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II, we see that Putin wants to reinvent or rebuild his Eurasian or Soviet empire. So this is why for Moscow, Moscow will use all financial, economic instruments to keep pressing Belarus. And I think European Union and Ukraine could be here considered as an advocate of democratic Belarus with the respect of human rights and of course with trans-border cooperation with our neighboring oblast. But I think that Ukraine also could become a model for Belarusian society, including civil society organizations, and all what have been done in Ukraine, like banning Russian movies with Putin's personal and propaganda. Also, when Ukraine received Tomos and autocephaly for Ukrainian Orthodox Church, we also realize that Putin is using Moscow Orthodox Church and Kirill to extend Ruski Mir, Russian world, at the territory of Belarus. So I think independence in media and especially banning social networks, like what Ukraine did in 2017, banning Odnoklasniki, banning another instruments of Russian hybrid warfare. So I think it's what we could be shared. And of course, for Mr. Putin, it's a part of his image. And I think US and the EU should be more proactively engaging in all contacts with Belarus, because we are not talking about the leadership of the country, but about the stability of the wider region. And through NB8, Nordic Baltic countries, and Ukraine, there could be different ways of cooperation, not just Eastern Partnership, but another instrument should be more proactively used to keep Belarus in more democratic sphere of influence, but not Russian one.
Yeah, Ambassador, just very short thing, because Belarus came into the picture because you put one of the key questions of this story, which is what would take Russia to really be forthcoming in getting a lasting solution for Ukraine, which is, peace for Ukraine on the basis of the European order that we define after the post-war accord. It's very telling what Mr. Sher said, that nobody in Russia would think that it's still a big power if finally it loses control over Belarus. Would you describe, you are in Canada, I have friends in Mexico, would you describe the relationship with the United States as control or even real heavy influence over Canada? And nobody doubts that the United States is a superpower. So this is the problem. The problem is that from the very beginning, every time Russia is in a conflict in the former Soviet Union, it is still there. The conflict is still there. We are seeing these days how people are killing themselves again in Nagorno-Karabakh. 30 years later. So again, as I said before, we cannot lose the bigger picture. And the bigger picture includes the evolution, the dynamics in Russia. And they are extremely complicated, and they don't go in the, I am afraid they don't go in the right direction to solving the conflict in Ukraine. Belarus is a different chapter we will be talking about, I guess, next week.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much. Many thought-provoking elements in the discussion. I think we can We saw today as well that Ukraine has put one of its best advocates, and I mean that both literally as a lawyer and figuratively as someone who is putting the case on the file. Whatever the formal leadership, Mr. Reznikov is in command of the dossier and is able to present it in a way that we have not previously seen. That is very encouraging. We've had a range of other opinions on the constraints, but also potentially some of the changes in the region that might provide some new hope for the balance of negotiating positions shifting in a way that we might have not only sustainable Russian interference, but maybe even sustainable peace at some point. Get the right kind of sustainability into the region. There was a question posted about the role Canada can play. I think it has done a lot through free trade. We're talking about the economic side. Certainly it has provided the military and police support that helps make Ukraine more sustainable and strengthens deterrence and therefore the negotiating position of the country. So thank you again to all of you across various continents and to our viewers, listeners, and chat participants worldwide. A pleasure to work on this with the representation of Ukraine to the EU, with the European Union, with experts in Tallinn and Kyiv, and civil society representatives right here in Toronto. So it's been great to be with you, and hopefully we can do this again in slightly more auspicious and hopeful circumstances that the initiatives being planned and announced in the coming days might lead us towards. So thank you again on behalf of the organizers, and hope to resume the conversation at a new and more advanced level.
Bye-bye from Brussels.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Roman. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye all.
Дякуємо за модерацію. Thank you for the moderation.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Everything in moderation.
He's up here.
Thank you.
Thank you.